Hello, everyone. Welcome back to OBScast, the official podcast of the Augustana Observer. I'm joined today by Observer staff Sophie Reed,
Hi.
Olivia Doak,
Hello.
Jordan Cohn,
Hello.
and our guests today, Observer advisors and Augustana professors, Dr. Schwartz
Hi, everyone.
and Dr. Yashur.
Hi there.
Welcome, everyone, to the show. Today, we're going to talk about news literacy due to its constant necessity and our current reality with journalism and pandemics. I kind of like to start with this just kind of overarching question of, what is news literacy and why is it important? Dr. Yashur, you teach a class about news literacy, so I kind of would like to direct this question to you.
So, news literacy is a basic understanding of what news is and how to be a critical consumer of it. And it's really important in this day and age, and especially with what's going on right now, to be able to understand understand what news you're receiving and how to sift through what's verified news versus misinformation that's being thrown around, and just to really critically analyze what you're receiving and what you're better understanding all the information that's being thrown at you constantly.
Why is this, obviously this is always important, but why is it different now as compared to, say, 10 years ago?
Well, the news is just, and channels and outlets are just so much more pervasive than they used to be. News literacy was just as important in 1953 as it is in 2020. The difference is how people are bombarded with it. You can't get away from it. You can't walk away from a newspaper and turn off the TV. It's with you all the time. We carry around devices that are intended to contact other people, their telephones and texting devices, but they double as our information devices. And to be without it is to feel lost. And it's really hard to turn off. It's hard to tune out. And because everyone has become a content producer in some way, it's become increasingly hard to know who to trust. And that's kind of the gist of it. We've gone from just a small handful of content producers to billions of content producers.
And also, the journalists used to be the gatekeepers, so they would be the ones that would vet the information that the general public would counter. And now, just like Dr. Schwartz was saying, we are getting much more of the unfiltered content. So it's up to us to weed our way through it.
Sophie, you had a really great question that we talked about earlier. Do you want to kind of jump into that?
Yeah, my question for you two is kind of in the age of COVID-19, I feel like we're just constantly facing even more of an onslaught of information and constant changes, and news organizations just constantly updating breaking news about something that is affecting each of us in a very real way. So I feel like my question is just, how do you practice news literacy when it seems like there's constantly information coming at you and from every single direction, from every single news source, 24 hours a day?
I personally just limit my exposure to it. I check verified news sources, some sources that I tend to trust in the morning when I wake up to find out what's occurred. I may check it once, maybe twice more that day, but I turn off my notifications. I don't get the constant notifications of this update and that update. I seek out the news when I want to see it or view it or read it, instead of letting it come to me all day long, because I think that would be completely overwhelming.
And that's just such a challenge, and I completely agree. The only way to manage it is to train yourself to not need it constantly, and that's hard because, through thousands of years of humanity, we've been trained to make ourselves aware of our community and our environment and what's going on around us. And now we have to counteract, those 1,000 years of instinct and stop trying to find out what's going on around us. Because if we don't, we'll be overwhelmed by things like push notifications, which should always be turned off on phones, for example. Because even if we consume the news, what are we supposed to do about it when we're being pinged every 5 minutes or every 10 minutes? All it does is activate our sense of heightened awareness. We can't really do anything about. So Dr. Yashur absolutely correctly said, one big part of news literacy today is teaching yourselves to step away and to almost on a schedule. Tell yourself, I'm going to check the news in the morning, maybe over lunch, again in the evening. I'm just not going to let it take control of my life.
Dr. Yashur, you mentioned like sources you trust. What is a good way to for consumers to determine whether or not their news source is a credible news source?
I think a good practice anytime you encounter questionable news is to check other sources. So if you encounter an article or a story or information that you're not seeing everywhere, go out and seek other news sources, legitimate news sources, your New York Times, your Washington Post, your Chicago Tribune, sources like that generally speaking have vetted the information that they're putting out there. Not always, but usually they're reliable. I would recommend always check other sources. Don't just rely on a single source for your information. See if other places are reporting the same thing. That's going to be your number one line of defense.
Jordan, you have a question about numbers and statistics. Do you want to kind of jump into that too?
Yeah, so I feel like statistics are easy to misuse and misinterpret. So how do journalists avoid misusing statistics, and how can consumers kind of fact check what they're reading in these stories that use statistics?
I think journalists need to be transparent with where they're getting their information, and that's true of quotes or data or statistics or any kind of information they're including. They need to be transparent about where that information is coming from. They need to go back to the original source and try to understand the research that's behind it or the way that the number was determined. I think that's the best way is to really understand what you're reporting and to pass that understanding along to your audience. Yes, statistics and numbers can be misused, misrepresented, and they are. And the problem is that those numbers become misrepresented, but then no one ever checks into them, and then they're just repeated over and over and over without anybody going back to really dig into what they mean. I think it is a problem, but I think transparency and having someone on the staff who understands statistics and understands numbers, look through the original study where they're getting their numbers from and hopefully determine the validity of them and not misrepresent them or take them out of context too. That's another problem that may occur.
So kind of moving forward with all these different sources of news, there's a lot, they all come from a different place. And this is kind of like another overarching question, but like, is there bias in news organizations?
I think that's asking a smart question, but it's not approaching it from the right direction. The question isn't whether there's bias. Of course, everyone's got bias. The question is whether the bias affects the coverage.
Right.
And so it's a challenge because it's almost not fair to put the burden on the consumer. In a perfect world, all the news organizations and the journalists who work for them declare what their biases are, but then behave in a way that shows their consumers that it can be fair and uncompromising and those biases aside to report the news. I think the one thing that people who train in news literacy or try to promote news literacy can do at a very basic level is teach students or just casual consumers of news the vital difference between what is news and what is opinion. So many times where this, this journalist is so biased happens when somebody reads or watches an opinion article or an opinion commentary and then says, this is biased. Of course it is. It's an opinion piece. If we could just get over this one huge hump of just helping people to distinguish that news is news and opinion is opinion, I think we could see, not all, of course, but we could see a lot of the confusion and the frustration in consumers start to dull just a bit.
So how can people distinguish the difference between news and opinions pieces then?
Read the headline. Sometimes it's labeled above it. It actually says opinion.
So yeah, if you read the headline, usually there are opinion or biased words in the headline. So if it's an opinion-laden headline, if it's saying, somebody's opinion about something right in the headline, there's your first clue. Straight news headlines will not have opinion words in them. Same goes for the entire article. If you read through it and it says, I think this, or I believe that, or is loaded with biased language throughout from the person who wrote it, then it's probably an opinion piece. Journalists are ethically prohibited from putting their own opinion into straight news pieces. Any opinion that you see in a straight news piece should be attributed to someone else. It should be within a quote with attribution of whoever said it.
Sophie, you had another point that I really want to touch on about, I think, in terms of what you talked about, news organizations not wanting to broadcast daily briefings about the pandemic. Were you able to find a source on that, or?
Yeah, I saw something on Twitter yesterday that said that organizations like CNN, NBC, and other big news organizations weren't going to broadcast from daily briefings, and because they thought it was better for the general public. But now I can't find anything backing that up. So
it's true. Some have already made that decision, and the New York Times used to create it live as well, and they stopped doing it. So that's been going on over the last couple of weeks. So that is something that is actually happening. They're still covering it, but just not live because it gives them a chance to fact check.
Right.
Oh, that must have been okay.
Well, I have a question for you guys. We talked earlier about the internet and the new challenges that poses for news literacy because it allows anyone to post anything. Do you guys think that there should be a way to regulate what people post and how to prevent false information from being spread out there? Or do you think that even though it presents a challenge, it should be protected?
I think the sort of the warning word there is allowed. When the word allowed gets thrown in there, it means that someone's got to provide that allowance, and someone has to be the judge and jury of what's going to be admissible and what isn't, and then how do you do that? I think you can take certain steps within media platforms and the current technologies to help people self-regulate. And I think one really big step would be to hold social media companies accountable legally as publishers of information, not just platforms that carry it. So now, Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act from the 90s tax places like Twitter or Facebook, the like. So if somebody were to put libelous or defamatory information up there, or false information that leads people to do damage to themselves, they are protected in the same way that a library is protected as not being the publisher of the books inside the library. But I think if you can amend Section 230 to hold Facebook or Twitter or another social media platform liable as a publisher and not just as the platform, I think you would see them cracking down a lot more on potentially damaging or false or hateful speech and information, because now they could be financially culpable for what were to happen within their platform. And it would take away a lot of them throwing up their hands and saying, oh, not our fault, but because they control, they are in a lot of ways the technological gatekeepers of the information. And once there can be some sort of course upon them, some of the damage that comes out of social media, then you would see them change very quickly.
And we've kind of talked about this a little bit in terms of the just absolute bombardment of news and just how everything has changed. But I guess what I'm trying to get at is I'm interested to see, I guess, where it goes now, both in the midst of a pandemic, but also in the political world. It's changed a lot in trying to cover current government, and I'm just curious what you guys think about everything that's happened.
I think the role of journalists has changed from being, as I mentioned earlier, a gatekeeper of, kind of filtering the information that the general public receives, to becoming more fact checkers and vetting the information that's coming out and verifying it, or figuring out that it's not accurate, and relaying that information to the public as a service to them, to us, so we can then determine for ourselves what do we believe. It's almost like now we're walking around in a hall of mirrors in a fun house, and it's hard to tell what's real and what's not, and I think journalists can help and are helping by being guides in that way, not taking the mirrors out necessarily, but helping us guide us through that house of mirrors, putting out, oh, this is accurate, or this is not, this is what we found. Context behind this quote that may have been pulled out of context. Those types of things I think journalists have been stepping up and doing to help us navigate the information that's coming at us.
The Los Angeles Times put out a really remarkable tweet earlier this year, the morning that Kobe Bryant died in a helicopter crash. And the story was broken by TMZ, and there's all sorts of false information flying around that his whole family was with him, or this was happening and that was happening, and nobody knew what was really going on. And Los Angeles Times was taking a pretty careful approach. It was in their backyard where it happened, and they would say, oh, helicopter went down, and it was Kobe's helicopter, and that was it. Then finally, their official LA Times Twitter account puts out a tweet saying, we are aware of all of the rumors swirling around on Twitter. We are chasing them down. We'll let you know when we know more. That was such a responsible thing to do, and such a respect building and an authority building thing the Los Angeles Times to do. And just within the comments that they got back from that tweet, or some of the readers saying, thank you, or we appreciate it. And, that's obviously not the kind of tweet that might have existed even just years ago. It was somebody on their social media team recognizing we need to acknowledge, we understand what is out there in the social media sphere. We're not going to regurgitate it or push it forward until we first validate it. We are letting you, our readers, know that we are working on it. And I think that same phenomena can be transferred over to political journalism that you are asking about, Kevin.
Kind of off of that, what do you two think about how news organizations have been continuously reporting about COVID and everything that's happening? Do you think that they've been doing a good job, or just how do you think they've been handling that?
I think I think some have been doing fine and some have not. Sort of the traditional players, the ones that you would expect to be doing a good job, or mostly doing a good job, you would expect, right? The local news organizations in some of the hot spots, like news organizations around New York, have done good with it. New Jersey have done pretty good with it. Older media have been especially careful. So what was once a newspaper but is now a news organization like Philly.com, which I think used to be the Philadelphia Inquirer or whatever else. They're trying to take a pretty careful approach. They've learned some hard lessons, and I tend to trust at this point anyway, I think that the official feeds, news organizations, are a little bit more reliable and a little bit more safe. And journalist within them. Like I'm making this station up, but I would trust feed of AQQR television station more than I would one of their reporters, because sometimes the reporters can be tempted to stray a little bit, be a little bit less safe. I think right now safe is good because people need safe and reliable. I think the feeds mostly of what we could call old journalism organizations are doing the best work.
I would echo that the news organizations, your more established ones, are verifying information, not putting information forward as readily, maybe as quickly. They're maybe holding back a hot second before they publish new information. They're making sure it's verified before it is put out there. That's what you want. We don't need to know every, as quickly as, as news breaks. We've been bombarded with this coronavirus news for a month, 2 months now, constantly. I think it's less important at this point that we get the latest update immediately. I'd rather wait an hour or however long it takes to make sure that information is true. I don't think we need it every, second by second updates. So I believe what Dr. Schwartz said is that, the more established organizations are doing that. They're doing a pretty good job.
I'm tying this back into a question from before about opinion versus news type of thing. It can be hard to determine on Twitter, but I have found that one, lack of better term, one breed of news source on social media that I've tried to avoid. Anybody on Twitter's handle or description says CNN or Fox or MSNBC contributor, that's their thing, like former this, former that. Contributors are the ones who are hopping on to give their hot takes, right? They're there to react, and that's their goal. And oftentimes they have 10 or 50 times more followers than just a beat reporter from the Asbury Park, New Jersey press, right? That Asbury Park reporter is in there and is talking to actual people and reporting news. As these cable news screaming talking heads, they make their money off of Twitter followers and off of being able to get the most clicks in a short amount of time. So that's one way to tie this whole thing back together of to trust, and if they are just there to quote unquote contribute, that actually produce new content. I'm not sure that's somebody that is really trustworthy online.
We are over time, so I think this is going to be where we wrap it up. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us on.
Thank you. This has been OBScast. See you next week.